There is a chapter in Paul Johnson's book, Modern Times, where he talks about the rise of Hitler and Stalin together, and he simply entitles it The Devils. Indeed, two of the most evil people in the 20th century rose as the leaders of large and powerful countries in somewhat parallel ways. And we're going to talk just about Stalin today. There are a lot of parallels with Hitler, and they at a certain stage immediately recognized each other as kindred spirits. Now let's go back to the conclusion of the Russian Revolution. Lenin, as we've seen, really led Russia into disaster. After the revolution, industrial production had dropped off almost completely. The farms were not producing food. Nobody who knew how to get the food from the farms to the cities was any longer around and able to make things function. So the result was famine and a total collapse of industry. Now, Lenin himself quickly realized that things were in desperate shape, and so in 1921 he instituted the new economic program, which allowed people to own some plots of land. Instead of having everything owned by the state, he thought people should be allowed to at least keep some of their crops for themselves, own some of their plots of land. And he set up a system of free exchange for peasant farmers to end the famine. Now you can perhaps imagine what was happening. If you're working a farm and someone says, "Comrade, do you support the union?" And you say, "Oh, of course I do." "So, are you willing to contribute your food to the greater good?" "Well, yes." "All of your food?" "Oh." "How much incentive do you have to work your farm if you get to keep none of the food that's grown?" Yeah, zero. And so what happened is people weren't producing food. To the extent that they were producing anything, they were trying to hide it from the government. Allowing people to keep at least a part of what they had gave people an incentive to farm their own plots of land, and indeed production on these privately owned plots suddenly soared and became very, very successful, even while the collectivized plots were suffering. Now, there's a general dilemma that lies behind this. Market forces tend to reassert themselves. Why? Well, because people care more about their own food than other people's food. They care more about their own children than other people's children, and so on. And so, to the extent that they're forced to just contribute to the whole, they tend not to contribute very much. So, this natural tendency of people to look out for themselves and their own, the people closest to them, reasserts itself. So, either you have to allow some resurgence of capitalism, as Lenin did in 1921, or as the Chinese government has over the last 10 or 20 years, or you've got to use force to stop market forces, at usually a terrible economic and human cost. Earlier, Lenin was trying to counteract all these market forces. To some extent in 1921 he gave up and realized that this was not working out and that he had to do something to try to accommodate the market. Now, Stalin's rise was in a certain sense inevitable. Roy's already mentioned that by the end of 1921, Lenin was largely incapacitated, and he died in 1924. What that meant is that a variety of people close to him began vying for power. And the rise of Stalin, Paul Johnson describes as moral relativism in a monstrous incarnation. Now, why monstrous? Well, Trotsky, another theorist who was close to Lenin, said problems of revolutionary morality are fused with the problems of revolutionary strategy and tactics. That's an abstract way of putting a very direct and practical point, which is whatever is good for the revolution is good, whatever is bad for the revolution is bad. Okay? In other words, the revolution is the sole arbiter of morality. There are no independent values to be imposed. Why does that enable monstrous behavior? Well, essentially he's saying all moral constraints are off. If it's promoting the cause of the revolution that this person or this class should die, they should die, there is no other moral constraint. Now, as I mentioned, Lenin died in 1924. By then, Stalin had already taken power. Here is Stalin sitting beside Lenin, back in the days after the revolution, but before Lenin became incapacitated. How did he take power? Well, it's a long and complicated story. It involves the use of force. But if you've ever seen the movie Mean Girls, you get the general idea, okay? Why do I say that? Well, for one thing, he posed as a moderate. He posed as everybody's friend. Okay? You've got a group of, say, 5 people. You want to be the one who, appears to be the reasonable one, stays on everybody's good side. But you also want to start getting people to undermine each other. So how do you do it? Well, here are some of his main competitors. Here is a young Stalin. And as you can see, before he got old and fat, he was a very young, handsome, dashing sort of guy. And then here's Leon Trotsky. Here is Zinoviev, Kamenev, and finally Bukharin. Those were the people who were closest to Lenin. Those were the people who were the obvious candidates for being Lenin's successor. Now, you're one of a group of 5 people. One of them is going to have supreme power in Russia. How do you get to be the one?
Get the others to fight each other.
Get the others to fight each other, exactly. And so that's precisely what he did. He tried to be buddies with every single one of them, but also, now give me the mean girls insight. You want to turn them against each other. How do you do it?
Gossip.
Gossip, yes. Did you hear what Trotsky said about you, Zinoviev? Oh, you wouldn't believe it. Kamenev. Let me tell you what Bukharin said the other day, and so on. He was a master at this kind of thing. Yeah.
And didn't he also monopolize on the fact that Trotsky was Jewish and he's different things that were seen as undesirable and made sure to instill a lot of propaganda explaining these things?
Ah, very good. Trotsky's Jewish. You can try to use that against him. But everybody's got something you can try to use against them, right? So exactly, he would try to say, look, this person isn't an adequate successor. Why? Well, they've got this other allegiance or that other allegiance, or look at who they've been friends with, or blah, 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 blah. You can always find something, right, that leads you to think, wait, maybe that person isn't to be trusted. Maybe they aren't really fully committed to the revolution, and so on and so forth. Maybe they have some other allegiance to a religious faith, or to an ethnic group, or to this or that or the other thing. And so gradually he undermined everybody else. Trotsky was the first. He was out by the end of 1924. He was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1928 and then murdered in Mexico in 1940 with an ice pick. Okay? These people weren't just allowed to go away and fade off into the background. They were actively killed because anyone who was still alive could be a competitor to Stalin for power. What about the others? Kamenev and Zinoviev were out in 1926. It took a little longer. Bukharin by 1928. Bukharin was considered the intellectual of the group. He was the one who was the theorist. And so he was the hardest, in a certain sense, to get plots going against, because he didn't seem to be actually seeking power. He didn't seem to be doing anything else. He was the one who seemed to be defining what the pure version of the revolution was. But nevertheless, Stalin was remarkably good at this. And at a certain point, he just used raw power. So here is Stalin, along with Rykov, Kamenev, and Zinoviev in happier times, around 1924, but it didn't last long. Pretty soon it was Stalin in supreme control. And he had a series of monuments built to himself, not only monuments in the forms of large dams, large factories, and so on, but also large statues, such as this one. He was described as the man of steel, the granite Bolshevik, the universal genius. Okay? He sort of became the center of this cult of personality. It began to corrupt almost everything, even Soviet science. Here is what one Soviet economist said: our task is not to study economics, but to change it. We're bound by no laws. Notice he's here referencing the last of Marx's theses on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. He's saying the economists have only described the world, but the point is to change it. We're bound by no laws, even economic laws. We get to define economics the way we want. And that was also Stalin's attitude about biology, about a variety of other fields. As we'll see, even astronomy. Now, in 1927, there was a poor harvest. The new economic policy in 1921 helped things, but in 1927, a variety of circumstances, including weather, conspired to make it a poor harvest. And the peasants would not accept paper money for their crops. After the war, the government had a great deal of trouble raising enough funds to actually make the currency worth anything. There started to be hoarding on the farms. People were hoarding food, and so there was no food in the towns. In fact, the first thing that happens when there's a shortage of anything is that people hoard it. What did people do when there was a gasoline shortage back in the 1970s? They stood in line for a long time to be able to fill up their car with gas. And they basically drove around with full tanks because you never knew where they could get more. Well, that kept the supply of gasoline low. And the same thing happened to food in this case. Well, Stalin sent 30,000 armed party workers into the fields to steal the peasants' food. As you can imagine, this was not an immensely popular move. But here are some photographs of people heading into the fields. As you can see here, armed with basically picks and rakes and things like that to try to steal the peasants' food. A system was set up where people would observe the peasants. This was an observation tower, often manned by children, who would be up there to watch the peasants as they worked in the fields to make sure people were not hiding food anywhere. Okay, and sometimes they were caught hoarding food. For example, here people had dug this underground den where they could store some wheat that they were, after all, harvesting on their own farm. They were caught in this case. This is officials finding the wheat. People who were caught hoarding in this way would be executed immediately. And actually, that's a photograph of target practice, but I wanted you to get the idea that they were executed immediately. So my putting it there is somewhat misleading. In any case, in 1928, since the peasants' food had been stolen, they planted less and worked less hard, and so the harvest was even worse. Now, the Russians by this point were desperate for cash, and the government began selling off art treasures and a variety of other things, basically any hard assets it could get its hands on at all. This is when Andrew Mellon saw an opportunity. He's pictured there. He created the National Gallery of Art in Washington as a testament that private philanthropy could outperform government, and in particular, that American free enterprise was a better system than socialism. And so he created, unfortunately named National Gallery, since most people think that's actually a government enterprise, but it's not. It was really set up by Mellon funds, and much of the art came from Russia. Now, in 1929, the next year, things began to look even worse. So Stalin, impulsively really, against the words of Marx and Lenin, without any debate or any discussion or any investigation, simply decided to collectivize all farms, in effect reversing what Lenin had done in 1921. So all the farms were to be collectively owned. Nobody was to have their own plot of land. Nobody was to be able to grow their own food or work on their own farm. He forced 105 million peasants into collectives. In many cases, this involved moving people hundreds of miles from the place where they had been living to some collective farm that had been established out in Siberia. This was 3/4 of the Russian population, many of whom got forcibly moved. He described it himself as an all-out offensive against the kulak. The kulak was just somebody who owned their own plot of land, okay, their own independent farmer, basically a small farmer. But the kulaks at this point got defined as state enemies. He said, we must smash the kulaks, eliminate them as a class, liquidate the kulaks as a class. Kolakowski described this as probably the most massive warlike operation ever conducted by a state against its own citizens. More than 100 million people were forced to leave their homes, forced to relocate, in many cases, into terrible situations. More than 10 million simply refused and were slaughtered. Another 10 million were transported to Siberia, not exactly a great place for growing crops. 10 million were moved to concentration camps. The rest lost all of their property and essentially became serfs of the state. They were enslaved in these things that were called grain factories, these semi-industrialized cooperative farms. It was really a man-made famine. More than half of all farm animals were simply slaughtered rather than allowed to be turned over to these collective enterprises. And so there was a huge loss of human life, huge loss of animal life, a tremendous destruction of the agricultural capabilities of Russia. And it did result in famine. Here are some photographs of people being collectivized, being moved off their farms, in many cases in the middle of winter with no clothing. 6 million perished in Soviet famine, wrote the Chicago American. So this was in some ways reported in the West. You can see here the they're dead farm animals that had nothing to eat. Here's an eyewitness account. Barefoot and poorly clad peasants were jammed into railroad cars and transported to the regions of Murmansk and the like. That's deep into Siberia. Well, actually, in Murmansk, far north. Peasants were unloaded into snow about 2 meters deep. The frost stood at 75 degrees below zero. Without even an axe or a saw, we began building huts from tree branches. In 2 weeks, all the children, the sick, and the elderly had frozen to death. So imagine being sent with nothing but the clothes on your back to a place where it's 75 degrees below zero. You have no tools. You're told to start a large farm. It's the middle of winter. A lot of people arrived in February. What do? There was no shelter. People died by the millions. Around the same time, because support for the regime by this point was crumbling, Stalin started a series of show trials where people were accused of crimes, and he used this as a way of trying to drum up popular support against those who were, in his view, evildoers. So in 1929, in particular, there were some mining engineers that were charged with sabotage when things went wrong on a particular project. He got a 12-year-old son to testify and demand the execution of his own father. These things were very carefully scripted and orchestrated. They were covered by the press. You can see here one of the halls where the trial was actually conducted with these large posters. The enemies of the state here were called wreckers, Stakyans. Arrest, try, shoot was Stalin's motto. You were to find the people who were wrecking the socialist economy. You were to arrest them, try them, and shoot them. And that is what began to happen on a large scale. The first target of this really intentionally caused famine was the Ukraine, which had been the chief grain-growing region of the Soviet Union. In 1931 through 1933, Stalin demanded large quantities of grain from the Ukraine, since he had largely destroyed farming in what had traditionally been Russia. In Ukraine, the farmers refused to release their grain stores, and so there was a natural conflict. What happened is that Stalin essentially moved in and starved the people intentionally. The estimates on dead from the famine range from 5 to 40 million dead. It's not clear, there were not records really kept of any of this, but the Ukraine was essentially starved into submission so that it would turn its grain over to the Soviet Union at large. And here you see officials who are armed watching people in the fields in the Ukraine during this time, actually making sure their grain went to the government, which then took it out of the Ukraine. Again, deliberate starvation of peasants. You see people with the distended bellies, who are virtual skeletons dying in the cold. Villages depopulated by hunger in the Ukraine as the Soviets punished their opponents. It wasn't, as we'll see, just over farming type issues. It extended much more extensively. Here are some of the dead from the famine. Now, throughout the 30s, the methods of Stalin inspired Hitler, and Hitler's methods inspired Stalin. At a certain point, Stalin realized, based on Hitler's example, that he didn't actually have to play these mean girls type games with his political opponents. He now had the power to simply shoot them. Now, up to this point, I think he was generally thinking you couldn't do that. You had to put on show trials. You had to do things indirectly by causing famines and so on. But suddenly he realized, wait, I don't have to do that. I can just order people to be shot. And so in 1934, he had more than 5,000 opponents murdered, including some of the people who had been with him at the early days of the revolution, Kirov, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. And in 1935, he began secret negotiations with Hitler that led to an alliance that ended only when Hitler turned around and invaded Russia. Now, there were a series of show trials for these officials, for a variety of people in 1936, for Radek and 16 others in 1937. There were 21 put on trial in 1938. There were confessions that were extracted under torture. Krasinski, for example, recanted on the first day, said, no, I haven't done any of the things you're accusing me of. He reinstated all the charges and confessed on the second day with a suspiciously dislocated shoulder. Almost all of these people were executed at the end of their trials. A few were sent to prison camps where they very soon died. The Dewey Commission investigated these trials because they were things that were put on actually as a show for Western journalists. John Dewey, the American philosopher, set up a commission to investigate the charges, and the conclusion was expressed in this little book, Not Guilty, where the conclusions were there was no attempt made in any of these trials to actually ascertain the truth. The confessions were palpably not true. They contradicted available and known facts. Trotsky in particular never plotted anything he was accused of, and so on. But none of it made any difference. The show trials didn't really succeed in convincing most people in the West. Nevertheless, there was this appearance of legality. There were many other victims of the Purge. 1,500 writers and artists. 27 astronomers. Stalin decided that sunspots were contradictory to Marxist theory. A lot of meteorologists for inaccurate weather predictions. Imagine the possibility of being shot for an inaccurate weather prediction. We'd have like nobody alive giving the weather any longer. Anyway, he described these as ex-kulaks, anti-Soviet elements of a variety of kinds. Almost 400,000 people were executed during this one wave, plus more than 100,000 people in Poland. Now, the Soviet archives actually detail some of this. The famines, not so much, but these kinds of things that were intentional, punishments, executions, exiles to concentration camps, there were actually extensive records. The Soviet archives indicate that about 1.6 million people were imprisoned, almost 700,000 shot. That's an average of 1,000 people per day being shot in 1937 and 1938. Now, some historians think that's an understatement, that only certain ones were recorded, others were happening without being recorded. Estimates range from about 1 to 2 million people. They have uncovered killing fields at Kuropatki and Bukivnia in the Ukraine They contain over 200,000 corpses. And in fact, what you see in the background is a memorial at Kurapati for the victims of this purge. There are starting to be attempts to actually catalog the victims. Here are some images from a website of people who were wiped out during these purges and executed. Now, I realize this is depressing. I can see a lot of you just kind of going, oh. It is hard to get your mind around it. André Gide described it this way. He said, no country today, he's writing in 1936, not even in Hitler's Germany is the spirit more suppressed, more timid, more servile than in the Soviet Union. I want you to think for a moment what it would be like if anything you say, anything you write, any book you read could be the cause of your being sent away to a prison camp or executed. What does that do to personal relationships? After all, anybody you talk to could be an agent of the NKVD, the secret police. Okay? What happens to you? What happens to the human personality under those conditions?
There is none.
That's right. You're afraid to say or do anything, right? Are you willing to write anything? Gosh, not anything anybody else is likely to see, and even if it's written for your own notes, you're in danger because anybody could come into your apartment and search it. Talk to people. Even those closest to you really could turn out to be agents of the state. And so it led to people being, well, timid, servile, frightened constantly. There was no one anyone could trust. Now this extended further and further as time went on. In 1937, Stalin killed 3,000 senior police officers, 90% of all prosecutors in the country, 30,000 army officers, 80% of all the colonels and generals, 1 million party members, members of the Communist Party itself. That was about 10% of the population. Why? Because they knew the history of the revolution. Anybody who was around to say, but wait, no, in 1917 that's not the way it was, he killed to make sure they didn't say anything that could contradict his own version of events. Now notice, you didn't actually have to do anything to oppose the state. You didn't have to write anything or say anything. Just having been there in 1917 so that you knew what had actually happened was enough to give you a sentence of death. And throughout this period in the late 30s, probably more than 1 million people per year were murdered. Here is an actual photograph of executions at Kurapati. People were stripped, shot in the back of the head. Now, in 1937, in the Red Army itself, 3 out of 5 field marshals were executed, 13 out of 15 commanders, 8 out of 9 admirals, 50 out of 57 Army Corps commanders, and on and on and on. Basically, anybody who was anybody in the army was executed. Now, what do you think that did to the Soviet army? Yeah, exactly. Anybody who was in a leadership position was killed. Okay, who's left?
Privates.
The nobodies, the privates, yeah, the people who don't know what's going on. What happened when Hitler attacked Russia in 1941, just a few years after this?
Anywhere he wanted.
He went anywhere he wanted to, exactly, because there was nobody in command who actually knew how an army worked. Okay? And indeed, by the time Hitler attacked, it was basically young guys in their 20s who were leading the Soviet army. Everybody older than that, and everybody with more experience had been executed. Now, well, it goes on and on, as you can see. I won't go through all of this. But notice that in the Communist Party itself, those who were on the Central Committee, the vast majority of them were simply executed. Now, at this point, he expanded greatly the system of prison camps throughout the Soviet Union. They had existed really from a few months into the revolution in 1917, but Stalin put them at a new scale. By the end of the 1940s, between 5.5 and 6.5 million prisoners were held in what became known as the Gulag archipelago. At the high point, there may have been as many as 10 to 15 million people in the system of prison camps at any one time. They were political prisoners. They were there for crimes against the state, for having thought, written, said something inappropriate, or simply belonging to the wrong class. More than 1.5 million died. To give you an idea of how extensive it was, those red dots represent prison camps. And as you can see, there were a lot of them, many of them in highly inhospitable places in Siberia. The most notorious was called Kolyma. I've been astounded that almost nobody knows what Kolyma is. I made reference to it in a logic book one time, and people wrote to me and said, what is Kolyma? Well, it was the biggest of the camps in the Soviet system, and there's an actual photograph of it. Here are people working in the mines at Kolyma. There were gold mines there, as well as other forestry operations and so on. People who were sent there were sentenced to hard labor and essentially worked to death. Here are people moving things by wheelbarrow. And I'll talk in a moment about somebody in particular who was sentenced to Kolyma and their story. But let me first say a little bit about what this did, again, to the human spirit. Anna Akhmatova wrote this. She was a poet whose husband was sent to the Gulag and who was executed. She says, "I've seen faces consumed, glimpsed horror under lowered eyelids, cheeks etched by pain." Her husband was murdered very early in this whole process in 1921. She was prohibited from publishing. She wrote, in response to the Great Terror in the 30s, something called Requiem. And what inspired it was this incident. She said, "One day somebody in the crowd identified me. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from cold, who had, of course, never heard me called by name before. Now she started out of the stupor common to us all and asked me in a whisper," everybody whispered there, "Can you describe this?" I said, "I can." Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face. And indeed, she wrote a poem, a long poem that was meant to describe the Great Terror. And I won't now go through the whole thing, but referring to the terror, I can't understand now all's eternal confusion. Who's beast and who's man? How long until execution? And indeed, that's the way most of the victims of the terror were. They were sent to these camps. Would they be sent home? Would they be transferred to another camp? Would they be executed? Families were completely in the dark about this. And so it was a torture for everyone involved. Now, one brigade commander described it this way: "I'm afraid to open my mouth. Whatever you say, if you say the wrong thing, you're an enemy of the people. Cowardice has become the norm." And indeed, Roy has shown you some examples of history being rewritten. Kamenev and Trotsky are in that photograph on the left. They're gone in the photograph on the right. Stalin began a systematic campaign to rewrite the history of the revolution. Let me talk about one particular person who was sentenced to Kolyma and who will show you the kind of thing that took place. This is a Ukrainian poet, Mikhailo Dreykomara. This is the book pictured there, Letters from the Gulag. He was seized in the middle of the night and sent to Kolyma. Basically, he and his family, he was arrested once in March, I think, and then released shortly thereafter. But a few months later, at 1 in the morning, there was a knock on the apartment door. He answered, and there were 4 agents of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They came in and began searching the apartment, saying, "Where are your weapons? Where are your armaments?" He said, "I don't have any weapons. I don't have any arms." They kept searching. They found nothing, but they took every paper. They took all of his books off the shelves and began searching through the marginalia to see what he had written in the margins. His daughter was asleep in her bed. They went in to see if anything was hidden under the bed. They simply dumped the bed with the small child in it. She was 7 years old at the time. She was, of course, panicked and screaming throughout the rest of this search. By 4 in the morning, they concluded there was really nothing there. Nevertheless, they arrested him, and he was never to come home again. His family never, well, except for one brief time, when his wife managed to see him a couple of months later in prison, his family never saw him again. What was his crime? Well, he had written in the Ukrainian language. He had written in particular a poem called White Swans. He was a naturalistic poet. He was somebody of the neoclassical school, and the Soviets decided this was anti-revolutionary. The images are pastoral, peaceful, farm-like settings of a peaceful life. That was decided that was unacceptable. That did not conform to socialist realism. And so he and everybody else who wrote in that particular school in the Ukraine were simply sentenced to prison and eventually to death. Now, there was the form of legality to all of this. His NKVD file is online. You can go and see it there. It's something like 70 pages that records everything he ever wrote, everything he ever published, every class he ever taught, everything he ever did, essentially. There is no crime in any of it. Nevertheless, he was accused of counter-revolutionary thinking, and so he was sent to Kolyma. Now, what is this poem, the one poem that got him into special trouble? Well, it was like this. Along the lake where willows branches stream, there swans in silence floating every day, do idly splash with beaks the waterway, and their necks bow like hosiers on the stream. But when the sounding frost like mirrors beam in inlets sleep, recalling flowery May, the swimmers break the ice as if 'twere clay, and no shore scares them by its frozen seam. Okay, it's this kind of thing. This could get you sentenced to death. Okay? And it goes on and on. I won't read the whole thing. But the idea really is that was enough to get you sent to a camp where people were asked to work in mines work in the farms, move earth without much equipment to help them. He writes in the letters about his feet being wrapped in rags. In the worst part of winter, they actually got some boots. But throughout most of the rest of the year, he would simply take rags, old newspapers and so on, and wrap his feet in those. When it's wintertime, he describes his own conditions. His hands would split open from the cold. His heels of his feet split open. He was, at one point, the hand became so infected he couldn't work and actually was given a few days off. The conditions in these camps were horrendous. People did not have enough to eat, so eventually they were simply worked to death. Now, amazingly, Western intellectuals often defended these tactics. There were a lot of people I could name. Here are some of the most prominent who actually defended Stalin. Lincoln Steffens, George Bernard Shaw, André Malraux, Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, Harold Denny and Walter Duranty of the New York Times. Their writings were in fact often used to break down the prisoners of the secret police. They would be interrogated and they would say, "Comrade, don't you understand? You're working against the revolution. Why, look, the revolution is wonderful." And then they would read them from the New York Times about how wonderful the Soviet experiment was. Brecht described it this way: the more innocent they are, the more they deserve to die. Now, it's really sort of hard to understand this. What were people thinking? Trilling here describes it as a sort of self-corruption, where people found some excuse for all of this that was happening. And there were some Western observers who actually went to the Soviet Union and wrote honestly about this. You've seen some of the headlines, especially from Chicago papers. New York newspapers tended to be supportive of Stalin, but Chicago papers actually reported on some of this. And also, the Manchester Guardian reported on it. Here was its main reporter, Malcolm Muggeridge, who went to observe Stalin's Russia and actually wrote about some of this. And he said, look, a lot of this was credulity. People were shown Potemkin villages, these exciting factories and so on. They were shown very carefully crafted scenes. But he said some of it was just the heroic lie. They wanted it to succeed, and so they told a series of lies. He said the novelty of this particular famine, he's writing here about the famine in the Ukraine, what made it so diabolical is that it wasn't the result of some catastrophe like a drought or an epidemic. It was deliberate. It was a creation of a bureaucratic mind, which demanded the collectivization of agriculture immediately as a purely theoretical proposition, without any consideration whatever of the consequences in human suffering. Stalin really did decide on the initial collectivization just sitting in his office. He had never been on a farm. He had never farmed himself. He didn't know anything about this, but he simply decreed it. Now, here is a questioner saying, you published a book, Winter in Moscow, when you got back. You were attacked in the press. He said, yes, very strongly, and I couldn't get a job. Why? Did people not believe you? He says, well, the press wasn't overtly pro-Soviet, but it was, as it is now, essentially sympathetic with that side and distrustful of any serious attack on it. So he found himself unemployable after writing about this. Now, they say, how do you explain this sympathy? And I think all of us in the West need to think carefully about this. Why did people know about this, know about the show trials, know about the famine, know about the collectivization, know about the intentional aspects to a lot of this, and nevertheless did not deny it? Because there really was a huge, large-scale denial until finally Solzhenitsyn, basically with his book, The Gulag Archipelago, broke it open and made it something that was officially recognized. Why did so many people persist in denial for so many decades? Well, here's what Muggeridge says. It's something I've thought and written about a great deal. I think the liberal mind's attracted by this sort of regime. He said, my wife's aunt was Beatrice Webb, and she and Sidney Webb wrote the classic pro-Soviet book, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. And so one saw close at hand the degree to which they all knew about the regime. They all knew about the Cheka, which was the early name for the secret police, and everything, but they liked it. This will be one of the great puzzles of posterity, looking back on this age, to understand why the liberal mind, the Manchester Guardian mind, the New Republic mind, should feel such enormous sympathy with this authoritarian regime. So the questioner says, you're implying that the liberal intelligentsia didn't overlook the regime's brutality, but actually admired and liked it. And he says, yes, I'm saying that. They wouldn't have admitted it, not even to themselves. But I remember Mrs. Webb, pictured there, one of the founders of the Fabian Society, a very cultivated, upper-class, liberal-minded person, saying to me, yes, it's true. People disappear in Russia. She said it with such great satisfaction that I couldn't help thinking there were a lot of people in England whose disappearance she would like to organize. So what happened here is that Stalin began plotting in a kind of Mean Girls fashion against his main competitors for power. Then began killing people, had this collectivization idea that resulted in absolute disaster. He responded by force and by intentionally creating the famine that had naturally resulted from the collectivization. Then he began realizing, given the example of Hitler, I don't actually have to pretend. I can just shoot or imprison my enemies, which he began to do on a vast scale. What's remarkable about this, in a sense, is that nobody did anything about it. Nobody really attempted to stop him from within the Soviet Union. They were too frightened. Or from outside. People watched with a kind of strange what? Yeah, apathy or... Now, we're going to see something later in the Second World War when, both within Germany and without, people become aware of the Holocaust. And they don't do anything about it. The Allies could have bombed the railroad tracks heading into the camps. They didn't do it. Okay, they could have accepted refugees that they refused to accept. People wouldn't do anything about it. So there are several times in the 20th century when what I want you to take away from today isn't just, yeah, lots of horrible, horrible things happened, but also that people who knew about them happening, and in some cases were actually in positions to do something about it, didn't do anything. They wouldn't even talk about it, wouldn't even try to bring awareness to it. And that's a huge moral failure that we can't put on any one political party, any one nation. It was something that extended through large swaths of society in the West as well as within the countries themselves. Yeah?
Do you mean to imply that we don't do that today?
No, I don't mean to imply that we're done with that and we don't do that today. I wish this were just history. Yes, way back in history, like, gosh, what? 80 years ago, people did this, but now we're cool. No, I mean, there's still this tendency of people to see horror taking place, to have the information there, to know what's happening, and yet do nothing about it. And so, yes, there are monsters actually causing all of this, but there's also a kind of monstrous inactivity on the part of people who could maybe have done something about it, at least drawn attention to it. And the diagnosis there is one that I think is puzzling. I present Muggeridge mostly because he's one of the few people to explicitly raise the question and say, what on earth was going on? Why didn't people do anything about it? Next time we will look at the rise of Hitler. As we'll see, Hitler found all sorts of new ways to inspire Stalin.